Bikers laughed at an old veteran's boots, unknowingly mocking a legend whose hidden past could destroy them. This single moment of disrespect ignites a war for a small-town soul, pitting a warrior's code against a bitter, personal vendetta. If you're new here, subscribe and comment your location. Now let's begin. Hey, Pops, lose your horse? Those boots look like they marched through the Revolutionary War. The voice, dripping with condescension, cut through the comfortable morning chatter of the Desert Rose Diner. Every conversation at the checkered tablecloth booths and the worn Formica counter stuttered to an abrupt halt. All eyes turned toward the speaker, a man named David, dressed in a ridiculously pristine, brand-new leather vest that practically screamed, "Poser," sitting amidst a pack of 24 grizzled, authentic bikers from the Sons of Wrath MC. David was the poison that had brought this storm of leather and a menace to the sleepy, sun-baked town of Sierra Springs. The old man, Arthur, didn't even flinch. He simply continued stirring his black coffee with a slow, methodical rhythm, the spoon making a soft, hypnotic clink against the heavy ceramic mug. He was a solitary figure at the end of the counter, a monument in faded denim and a worn leather jacket that had seen more seasons than all the Sons of Wrath combined. But it was his footwear that had drawn David's contemptuous attention, a pair of ancient, scarred, yet impeccably polished combat boots, the leather soft and supple with age, molded to the shape of his feet over countless miles. "I'm talking to you, old-timer," David sneered, puffing out his chest and relishing his captive audience. He was a corporate raider from Omni Development, a faceless conglomerate hungry for the land Sierra Springs sat on, and he'd hired the Sons as his blunt instrument of intimidation. Mocking the local color, breaking their spirit piece by piece was all part of his psychological playbook. "Seriously, where'd you dig those relics up? A museum of pathetic, outdated history?" A few of the younger, more impressionable sons, like a hot-headed, eager-to-please prospect named Leo, chuckled nervously, but the sound was strained, forced. Their president, a mountain of a man named Marcus, who bore a Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor tattooed prominently on his corded forearm like a badge of a different life, remained silent. He didn't laugh. His eyes, sharp and assessing, were fixed on the old man's ramrod straight back, a faint, uneasy line forming between his brows. There was a quiet dignity to the old man that set off alarm bells in Marcus's soldier-honed instincts. Arthur took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, the mug looking almost comically small in his large, work-roughened hands. He placed it down on the counter with a quiet, yet definitive click that echoed in the sudden hush. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 yesterdays and 100 silent battles, he slowly, stiffly, swiveled on his stool to face them. His face was a topographical map of a life lived hard and on the edge, etched with canyons of wrinkles and mesas of old scars. But his eyes were a startling, clear, piercing blue, holding a calm so profound it felt deeper and more vast than the desert sky outside. They settled on David, not with anger or fear, but with a weary, almost clinical assessment, as if studying a particularly unimpressive and noisy insect. "They're comfortable," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, the sound of tectonic plates shifting deep beneath the earth, a voice that commanded attention without ever needing to raise itself. David barked a laugh, a sharp, ugly sound that grated on the tense silence. "Comfortable? They look like they're one step away from the city dump. Just like this pathetic, backward town. Clinging to your worthless junk, your worthless land. It's sad, really. It's time to move into the modern world." Arthur didn't offer a rebuttal. He didn't engage. Instead, he leaned over slowly, his movements stiff with age yet deliberate with a purpose that was both unnerving and fascinating. A profound hush fell over the diner, so complete you could hear the frantic buzz of a fly trapped against the window pane and the low hum of the neon open sign. He began to unlace his left boot with a practiced, unhurried ease. "What are you doing, old man?" David scoffed, though a thread of genuine confusion and unease now wove through his performative bravado. "Trying to prove they're full of holes? We can all see that plain enough." Arthur ignored him completely, as if he were nothing more than background noise. He pulled the heavy, well-worn boot off, revealing a thick, gray wool sock. Then he performed an act that sealed the room in a vacuum of absolute breathless silence. He reached inside the boot, his gnarled, powerful fingers searching for a moment with an intimate, familiar knowledge before finding their target. With a gentle, almost reverent pull, he removed the worn leather insole. He held it up, not toward the sputtering, red-faced David, but directly toward Marcus, the biker president. Stamped clearly into the leather, faded by decades of sweat, blood, and countless miles of marching over every kind of terrain imaginable, but utterly unmistakable, was the crest of the United States Army Special Forces. The iconic, feared, downward-pointing sword crossed by 3 lightning bolts. A beret flash, and below it, stenciled in ink that time and hardship had almost erased, was a name, Pendleton, A., and a designation that made the very air in the diner crackle with electricity, SFOD. Marcus, the president of the Sons of Wrath, went perfectly, utterly still. All the color drained from his face, leaving his normally tanned skin a sickly shade of pale. His own military service had been brief, a 4-year stint in the Marines that had seen some action, but it had been long enough and intense enough to brand into him a profound, bone-deep, almost holy respect for the men who wore that specific, legendary insignia. SFOD Delta Force, the absolute tip of the spear, the best of the best. The men who went into the mouth of hell when everyone else was running the other way. The ones who did the jobs no one else could or would. They were myths, ghosts, whispered about in hushed tones, and here one sat, in a dusty roadside diner, being mocked by a suit who wouldn't last 5 minutes in their world. He stood up, his chair legs screeching in protest against the linoleum floor. The sound unnaturally loud. His massive frame seemed to block out the sun streaming through the diner window. He looked from the insignia, a symbol of a level of commitment, skill, and sacrifice he could only dimly comprehend, to Arthur's calm, unwavering, ice-blue eyes. And he saw the truth in them. This was no ordinary old man. "You will shut your mouth." Marcus's voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of a sledgehammer, a command that brooked no argument and silenced the room even further. He wasn't talking to Arthur. He was staring directly at David, his gaze burning with a cold, dangerous fire. "You will show this man the respect he has earned 1,000 times over, or you will find another ride back to whatever glass and steel prison you call home, and you will do it now." David's smug, superior expression shattered into 1,000 pieces of stunned, sputtering outrage. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. "What? Marcus, have you lost your goddamn mind? He's a nobody, a senile old coot who can't even afford new boots. He is Delta," Marcus interrupted, his voice dropping to a deadly, guttural whisper that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. "You have no idea what that means. You couldn't possibly comprehend it. Your tiny world of spreadsheets and profit margins doesn't have a box big enough to fit what this man is. I have a small idea, and it commands respect, the kind of respect you buy with blood, not money. Now you will sit down, you will shut your mouth, or you will get the hell out of my sight. Final warning." The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it inverted, exploded, and reformed entirely in the space of those few seconds. The bikers who moments before had been David's intimidating, leather-clad entourage now looked at the old man with a mixture of raw awe and primal fear. They looked to their president, whose loyalty had just publicly and violently pivoted from a deep-pocketed client to a stranger in a pair of old boots. This was a code they understood, deeper than any business contract. Arthur held Marcus's intense gaze for a long, weighted moment, a silent conversation passing between them in the space of a heartbeat. A language of service, sacrifice, and a shared understanding of a world David Thorne would never be able to access, a world where your life depended on the man next to you. Then Arthur gave a single, slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement. He carefully, almost ritualistically, replaced the insole, pulled his boot back on, and began to lace it up with the same deliberate, unhurried motion, as if the entire dramatic interruption had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He then turned back to his coffee, his posture making it clear the conversation was irrevocably terminated. The spectacle was over. David stood there, rooted to the spot, his face a thundercloud of fury, humiliation, and utter disbelief. He had been publicly neutered, emasculated in front of the very men he was paying to project his power and fear. The entire carefully constructed plan to intimidate Sierra Springs was crumbling because of one unassuming old man and his goddamn ancient boots. His eyes, burning with a hatred that felt unnervingly personal and deep-seated, bored into Arthur's back, as if trying to ignite the worn leather of his jacket through sheer will and malice. The confrontation at the Desert Rose Diner became the shot heard round Sierra Springs. The story spread through the small town with the speed of a grease fire, leaping from porch to porch, shop to shop. The quiet, solitary Arthur Pendleton, who lived in a modest, tidy cabin on the ridge and kept to his own quiet routines, wasn't just a veteran. He was Delta, a living legend. And he had faced down the corporate bully and his entire gang of biker muscle without even raising his voice, without a single threatening word. He had simply shown them who he was, and that had been enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rugged horizon, painting the sky in a spectacular, fiery tapestry of orange, purple, and crimson, a small, determined delegation from the town council found Arthur behind his cabin, splitting logs for his winter woodpile with a powerful, practiced, rhythmic swing of his axe. The group was led by a woman named Elena, the town's mechanic, auto shop owner, and de facto leader, a woman whose hands were just as capable and strong with a wrench as they were with comforting a scared child. With her was the town's mayor, a gentle, kind-hearted, but perpetually overwhelmed man named Mr. Higgins. "Mr. Pendleton," Elena began, her voice respectful but layered with a steel resolve that had been tempered in her own life struggles. She wiped a smear of grease from her cheek with the back of her hand, a gesture that was uniquely hers. "What you did today, you have no idea what it meant to people. You gave this town its backbone back. We're forming a resistance committee. We want to fight omni-development, and we were hoping, we were praying, you'd lead it." Arthur sunk the axe head deep into the thick stump with a solid, satisfying thwack and wiped his brow with a faded red bandana. "I'm not a leader, ma'am." "You are, whether you want the title or not," she replied, her gaze steady and unflinching, meeting his blue eyes without a trace of fear. "They're terrified of you. That David guy, he looked at you like you were his own personal ghost, a nightmare made flesh." She took a step closer, the scent of motor oil, honest sweat, and the clean, dry aroma of desert sage clinging to her. "My brother was Army, 101st Airborne, Screaming Eagles. He told me stories about the quiet ones, the professionals who didn't need to shout to command a room, whose presence alone could change the air pressure. We need that quiet strength, Arthur. We're just mechanics, teachers, and farmers. We don't know the first thing about fighting something like this, something this soulless." Arthur looked past her, his gaze sweeping over the quiet, vulnerable town nestled in the valley below. He saw the simple white church spire, the warm golden lights flickering on in kitchen windows as families gathered for dinner, the neat geometric rows of fields that had been nurtured by generations of the same families, their roots sunk deep into this hard, beautiful land. He had come to Sierra Springs to forget war, to bury the past, to find a sliver of peace in the vast, forgiving silence of the desert. But true peace, he had learned long ago, was not something you found like a lost coin. It was something you built day by day, something you protected with your own two hands, and if necessary, with your life. "I'll advise you," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, the decision made. "I won't lead you, but I'll show you how to fight." The very next day, the war for the soul of Sierra Springs began in earnest. It was not a war of bullets and blood, not yet, but a war of wills, of pressure, of psychological attrition. Arthur's first lesson, delivered in the back room of Elena's garage, was intelligence gathering. He had Elena and a hand-picked team of volunteers use their smartphones not for social media, but for surveillance, documenting every Omni development vehicle, logging license plates, times, and detailed descriptions of every interaction with David or the Sons of Wrath. He taught them about patterns of harassment, about the critical importance of creating a meticulous, time-stamped, unassailable paper trail that would stand up in any court. He set up a rotating watch schedule, using the strategic high ground of his cabin to monitor all major access roads into the valley with a pair of high-powered binoculars, his military eye missing nothing, every movement logged and analyzed. David's tactics escalated, but they were now met with a wall of organized, silent, observant resistance. The Sons of Wrath, still operating under Marcus's financially obligated but increasingly reluctant and disgusted command, engaged in louder, more blatant intimidation, blatantly revving their engines late into the night, parking in menacing, silent rows in front of local businesses, their collective stare of physical weight. But the dynamic within the club had fractured. Marcus, haunted by the sight of that Delta Insignia, a symbol that represented everything his own Marine service had aspired to be, gave his orders with a distinct lack of conviction, his heart and his honor no longer in the game. The younger members like Leo, who had initially been thrilled by the easy money and the thrill of playing the heavy, now felt a creeping, uncomfortable shame, especially when they saw the town's children watching them from behind curtains and screen doors with wide, fearful, innocent eyes. One of them, the prospect Leo, was given the distasteful task of slashing the tires on the town's vital, irreplaceable farming equipment. As he crept behind the feed store under the cloak of a moonless, inky black night, the desert chill seeping into his bones, a calm, disembodied voice spoke from the deep shadows of the loading dock, a voice that seemed to come from the darkness itself. "That's a costly mistake, son, for the farmer who needs to feed his family, and for your own soul." Leo nearly leaped out of his skin, fumbling the switchblade in his suddenly sweaty hand. Arthur Pendleton was sitting on an overturned crate, as still as the surrounding rocks, meticulously field stripping an old but perfectly maintained Colt 1911 pistol, the components laid out on a clean, oil-stained rag before him, the metal gleaming faintly in the scant starlight. "Holy hell, old man! How do you just appear like that?" Leo stammered, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest. A cold fear gripping him that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with being in the presence of something far greater than himself. "You walk like you're trying to punish the ground," Arthur said, not even glancing up from his work, his fingers moving with an effortless, practiced precision. "And you breathe like you're announcing your arrival to the whole county. If you're going to choose a path of dishonor, at least have the professional courtesy to be quiet about it." Leo, instead of responding with the anger he usually defaulted to, found himself utterly mesmerized, humbled. The quiet, absolute, unshakable authority the old man projected was more intimidating than any shouted threat from Marcus or any other biker he'd ever known. Are you really Delta Force?" he whispered, the words feeling both sacrilegious and awestruck, as if asking a priest if he'd really seen God. Arthur finally looked up, his blue eyes seeming to pierce through the darkness directly into Leo's soul, seeing every bad decision, every moment of weakness, every flicker of doubt. "That was a lifetime ago," he said, his voice low and serious, devoid of nostalgia or pride. "It was a simple statement of fact. Why are you doing this, kid? This isn't your fight. These people have done nothing to you. They're just trying to live their lives." Leo shuffled his feet in the dust, suddenly looking every bit the lost, confused boy he was beneath the tough guy facade. "The money's, it's more than I've ever seen, more than my old man made in a year. And Marcus, he said the club needed the capital, for expansions, new bikes, for our future." "There's building a future," Arthur said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost paternal. "And there's burning down someone else's future to warm your hands. A man's worth isn't measured by the patch on his back or the money in his pocket, but by the moral lines he draws in the sand. and the ones he refuses to cross, no matter the cost. You need to decide which side of that line you want to stand on, son. And you need to decide soon because a storm is coming, and when it hits, there won't be any middle ground left. He stood up, assembled the pistol with a series of smooth, practiced, lightning-fast clicks and slides that sounded unnaturally loud and final in the silence, holstered it at the small of his back with a motion that was pure muscle memory, and tossed a small, hand-whittled piece of wood to Leo. It was a perfect, intricate, beautifully carved miniature of the Special Forces crest. Then without another word, he turned and seemed to simply dissolve back into the shadows from which he came, leaving no sound, no trace, as if he were a ghost. Leo stood frozen for a long time, holding the wooden crest, the weight of it feeling immense in his palm, the switchblade, and his forgotten, shameful mission lying in the dirt at his feet. The encounter was a seed planted deep in the fertile soil of a conflicted conscience, and it had already begun to take root. The conflict reached its first true, public boiling point at a town hall meeting held in the local school auditorium. The room was packed, the air thick with anxiety and a newfound fragile determination. David, livid at the town's unexpectedly organized, resilient, and frustratingly passive-resistant opposition, stormed the meeting with a hand-picked group of his most loyal, intimidating sons of wrath, their heavy boots stomping on the polished floor. "This is your final warning," David shouted, his face a mask of pure, unvarnished rage that seemed to go far beyond a simple business negotiation, a rage that was personal, festering, and deeply unhinged. "Sign the goddamn papers, or we will systematically dismantle this pathetic, backward little town, brick by fucking brick. We will burn it to the ground and piss on the ashes." The townsfolk recoiled as one, a wave of fear passing through them. But Elena stepped forward, planting her worn work boots firmly on the scuffed wooden stage, a mechanic facing down a grizzly bear. "The answer is no, Mr. Thorne. Now I'll ask you to leave. This is a private town meeting. You are not welcome here." David's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of shock and something else. Recognition? At the use of his real surname, a detail he'd carefully kept hidden from these simple folk. He recovered with a vicious sneer, stepping deep into her personal space, using his height and his proximity to intimidate. "Or what, mechanic? You and your committee of cowardly sheep will make me? You'll get your hands dirty." It was then that Arthur, who had been standing motionless and observant near the fire exit at the very back of the hall, a shadow among shadows, moved. He didn't rush. He didn't yell. He simply walked forward, his old combat boots making a soft, rhythmic, almost metronome-like thud on the wooden floorboards, a sound that cut through the panic and commanded attention. The crowd parted for him without a sound, a human Red Sea yielding to an unstoppable, inevitable force. He walked right up to David, stopping so close their chests were almost touching, invading the younger man's space with an unnerving, absolute calm that was more threatening than any shouted threat. "The lady asked you to leave," Arthur said, his voice still quiet, but it now carried the sharp, cold, unmistakable edge of a razor being drawn slowly from its sheath, a promise of violence held in check by will alone. David, emboldened by the presence of his biker escort and his own towering ego, let out a contemptuous, nervous laugh and jabbed a finger hard into Arthur's sternum. "And what are you going to do about it? You washed-up old relic? Huh? Your war is over. You're a museum piece, a nobody, a has-been who lives in a shack." Arthur's hand moved with a speed that was almost a blur, a fluid, economical motion that was more instinct and training than conscious thought. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't need to. He simply captured David's offending wrist in a grip that felt like it was made of forged iron, his thumb pressing down with precise, brutal, clinical efficiency on a specific, excruciating nerve cluster. David gasped, a strangled, pathetic sound, his face instantly draining of all color, his knees buckling as a wave of nauseating, blinding pain shot up his arm. It was a move of absolute, humiliating control, designed to inflict maximum compliance with minimal, almost surgical force. It was a message written in pain. My war, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper that slithered into David's ear alone, a serpent's promise, is eternal. And it is always with men like you. Bullies, cowards who hide behind money and hired muscle. Men who have never earned a single thing of true value in their entire pathetic lives. Now you have a choice. You can walk out of here on your own 2 feet with what little dignity you have left, or I can carry you out. The choice is yours, but you have 5 seconds to make it. The charged electric silence was shattered by Marcus's voice, hard and flat and final. David, we're leaving. Now. The command left no room for debate. The sons of wrath, seeing the unyielding stone in their president's eyes and the terrifying competence in the old man's quiet stance, reluctantly moved forward. They had to physically intercede, pulling a seething, humiliated, and pain-racked David Thorne from the auditorium, his screams of incoherent rage and promises of vengeance echoing down the empty school hallway. Later that night, long after the town had settled into an uneasy, watchful quiet, a lone figure approached Arthur's cabin, its outline stark against the star-drenched sky. It wasn't a son of wrath. It was David. He held no weapon, only a bottle of obscenely expensive Louis XIV cognac, a pathetic, transparent peace offering. A truce, David said, his voice strained. A painfully transparent fake smile stretched across his face like a poorly fitted mask. I think we started off on the wrong foot, a simple misunderstanding between businessmen. Arthur stood on his porch, a stark, unmoving silhouette against the single, warm light burning in his living room window, a solid shadow against the infinite, cold canvas of the desert night. There was no misunderstanding, Thorne. State your real business. I'm tired. The smile vanished, wiped away like dirt from a window, revealing the raw, festering hatred beneath. David's eyes, now that the facade had dropped, burned with a decades-old, bitter resentment that finally surged to the surface, poisoning the air between them. Pendleton, Arthur Pendleton. I should have recognized the name the second I heard it in the town records. My father was Colonel James Thorne. Does that name ring a bell for you? Or have you left so many broken men in your wake that you can't keep track of the bodies? Arthur went very, very still, his posture shifting from relaxed readiness to the absolute, predatory stillness of a wolf that has just heard the snap of a twig in the dark. The name landed in the quiet night not like a name, but like a live grenade, its pin pulled, rolling into the center of his hard-won peace. Colonel James Thorne had been his commanding officer, a brilliant, hard, fiercely disciplined, and respected leader, a man Arthur had looked up to, a man he would have followed into the gates of hell itself, until a covert black ops mission in a god-forsaken, nameless jungle went catastrophically, hellishly sideways. Under a storm of unexpected, overwhelming, and brutal enemy fire, the colonel's mind had locked. He had frozen, his command dissolving into chaos and panic, leaving his team, including a young Sergeant First Class Arthur Pendleton, trapped, surrounded, and bleeding out in the mud. Arthur had taken command in the vacuum, using every ounce of his training, his will, and his soul to get most of them out alive. But the colonel was quietly, disgracefully discharged for cowardice under fire. The official record was sanitized, a medical discharge, but the stain, the shame, was a poison that seeped into the rest of his life. He never came back from that, David spat, the venom now overflowing, a geyser of long-suppressed fury. Not really. He was a hollow man after that. He drank himself to death, night after night, for 10 long years, and every single night he talked about you. About the great, the perfect, the infallible Arthur Pendleton, the man who could do no wrong, the man who did what he couldn't. You and your precious, sanctimonious Delta Force. You broke him. You were the ghost that haunted him to his grave. You and your silent, judging, superior stare. You were the embodiment of everything he failed to be. This was the real war. It had nothing to do with land, money, or corporate expansion. It was a son's twisted, furious, lifelong vengeance for a father's shame and suicide. David had specifically sought out the Omni development deal for Sierra Springs precisely because his private investigators had told him this was where Arthur Pendleton had hidden himself away. The entire campaign of terror, the intimidation, the threats, it was all a proxy war, a long-conceived, meticulously planned attempt to destroy the man he blamed for his father's ruin and ultimate slow-motion death. The town was just collateral damage, a pawn in his obsessive personal crusade. Arthur looked at the bitter, broken, hate-filled man standing before him, shaking with decades of nursed rage, and for the first time, a flicker of profound, soul-deep sadness. An emotion far more complex and weary than pity crossed his weathered face. "Your father was a good man, David. One of the bravest I ever had the honor of serving with," he said, his voice low and heavy with the memory. "But war is a cruel, unforgiving beast that doesn't just break bones and spill blood. It breaks minds. It breaks spirits. It holds up a mirror to the deepest, darkest, most fragile part of a man's soul and forces him to look. Your father looked into that abyss, and the abyss, it stared back. It consumed him from the inside out. I didn't judge him. I grieved for him. I still do." "I don't want your grief. I don't want your goddamn pity," David screamed, his voice cracking with the raw, unrestrained force of his hysteria as he hurled the priceless bottle of cognac against a nearby juniper tree, where it exploded in a spectacular shower of crystal shards and amber liquid that looked like splattered blood in the pale moonlight. "I want you to suffer. I will burn this entire shithole town to the ground. I will salt the earth they walk on, and I will make you watch every single second of it. I will destroy everything you give a damn about, everything you've tried to build here, just like you destroyed my father." He turned and stormed off into the consuming darkness, his ragged, sobbing breaths and the crunch of his furious footsteps on the gravel, the only sounds echoing back toward the cabin long after he was gone from sight. Arthur stood alone on his porch for a very long time. The ghosts of the past, which he had fought so hard to bury out here in the clean desert air, now swirling around him in a deafening, accusing cacophony, their cold fingers reaching for him from the jungle of his memory. The battle for the town's future had just transformed into a deeply personal, bloody siege against one old soldier's soul. He knew then, with a chilling, tactical certainty that settled deep in his bones like a winter frost, that David Thorne would not stop. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The rules of engagement had been incinerated. The time for quiet resistance, for documentation and patience, was over. A storm of pure, unadulterated vengeance was coming, a hurricane of hatred aimed directly at him, and Arthur Pendleton would have to reach back into the darkest, most lethal, most unforgiving parts of himself, into the man he had tried so hard to leave behind in those jungles and deserts, and become the weapon he had once been, one last time, to meet it and protect the innocent people who had, against all odds, become his to protect. The silence after David's departure was heavier than any Arthur had known in the desert. It was the silence before the artillery barrage, thick with the promise of incoming fire. He stood on the porch until the moon was high, his mind no longer in the peaceful desert, but back in that steaming, claustrophobic jungle. The smell of damp rot and cordite filled his senses, the sound of Colonel Thorne's broken whimpers echoing in his ears, a sound he'd carried for 30 years like a stone in his soul. Now the sun was here to collect a debt written in blood, and he intended to use the entire town as currency. He didn't sleep. He spent the night checking his cabin's perimeter, his movements silent and efficient, a ghost in his own home. At first light, he was at Elena's garage. He found her already there, a pot of strong, bitter coffee brewing on the workbench, as if she'd known he would come, as if she'd been waiting for him. "It's worse than we thought," Arthur said, his voice rough from the night's vigil. He told her everything: the frozen command in the jungle, the disgrace, the slow, agonizing suicide by bottle, the son's all-consuming vendetta. Elena listened, her face growing pale but her gaze never wavering. She poured him a mug of coffee, her hand steady. So this was never about money. It was never about land. It's about a ghost, Arthur replied, accepting the mug, the warmth a small comfort against the cold truth. And he's going to use this town as a sacrifice to lay it to rest. He'll escalate. The gloves are off now. He's declared total war. The first blow fell not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap of malice that shocked the town to its core. That afternoon, the historic grain silo on the Henderson farm, a landmark that had stood for a century, a symbol of the town's agricultural heart, was dynamited. The explosion rocked the entire valley, a deep percussive whoomp that felt like a punch to the chest, sending a plume of dust and splintered wood high into the azure sky. There were no witnesses but a single, custom-made motorcycle grip, the kind used exclusively by the Sons of Wrath, was found tossed carelessly in the field like a calling card. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was annihilation. The town was gripped by a new, raw, primal fear. This was an attack on their history, their identity, their very reason for being. Marcus and the sons arrived as the dust was still settling, the acrid smell of explosives hanging in the air. The president's face was a mask of cold, murderous fury. He didn't bother with words. He strode directly to David, who was watching from the climate-controlled comfort of his rented SUV, and ripped the door open, grabbing him by the throat and slamming him against the vehicle. "That was a landmark, you psychotic bastard!" Marcus roared, his voice trembling with a rage so pure it was almost holy. "We're done. The deal is off. I should kill you right here and save the state the trouble." David, gasping for air, his eyes bulging, managed a strangled, gurgling laugh. "Too late, Marcus. You're in this now, up to your neck. You think your reputation is mud if you walk away? What do you think happens if I tell the authorities it was your boys who provided the explosives? Your clubhouse where you stored the C4? You'll all go away for domestic terrorism. This is a partnership now, whether you like it or not. You're mine." The threat was a masterstroke, a checkmate of coercion. It wasn't just about reputation or money anymore. It was about freedom, about spending the rest of their lives in a concrete box. Marcus's grip loosened, the fight draining from him, replaced by a sickening, helpless realization. He was trapped. His club was trapped. They were all pawns in David Thorne's mad game. As the sons mounted their bikes to leave, the air thick with their collective shame and impotent fury, Leo once again did not move. He looked at the crying Henderson family, at the blackened scar on the land, and then at Arthur, who stood watching with the calm of a man who had seen true apocalypse. Leo walked over, his young face set in grim lines. "I'm not leaving," Leo said, his voice firm, his eyes clear and decided for the first time. He looked at Arthur, a student addressing his master. "You were right about the line. He's on the other side of it. I'm staying on this side." Arthur gave a grim, approving nod. "Then it's time you learned how to really fight. Not with switchblades and petty vandalism. With your mind, and if it comes to it, with your hands." With the Sons of Wrath now unwilling, blackmailed participants in David's war, the atmosphere in Sierra Springs turned toxic, the air itself seeming to curdle. David's new enforcers, a crew of 6 hardened, soulless ex-cons, led by a scarred, hulking brute everyone called Jaw, became brazen, their actions crossing from intimidation into outright terrorism. They didn't just threaten, they acted. They firebombed the town's only fire truck, rendering it a charred skeleton. They poisoned a farmer's well with diesel fuel, contaminating his water supply for a year. They left a gutted, mutilated coyote on the steps of the elementary school, a message so vile it made parents physically sick. Arthur's strategy shifted instantly from a defensive posture to one of active, organized resistance. He turned Elena's garage into a command center, a war room smelling of oil and determination. A large, detailed map of the town was pinned to the wall, with colored pins marking every incident. He organized the townsfolk into shifts, creating a 24-hour watch with a network of CB radios, turning farmers and mechanics into a coordinated, if amateur, intelligence network. He taught them basic field medicine, how to create makeshift barricades, and how to use the desert itself, the arroyos, the mesas, the thick stands of chaparral, for cover and concealment. He was turning shopkeepers into a guerrilla militia, and they were learning fast, their fear transforming into a fierce, protective resolve. One evening, as Arthur was showing Elena how to quickly disable a vehicle by pulling the distributor cap, a vital tactic for immobilizing threats, their hands touched over the engine block. A jolt, hot and entirely unexpected, passed between them, a live wire of connection. Elena looked up, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted in surprise. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. For a fleeting, stolen moment, the ever-present danger, the constant tension, faded into the background, replaced by a different, more primal, more human tension. "You know," Elena whispered, her voice husky, "for a man who's all about control and procedure, you're making my hands shake." Arthur's gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips, then back again. The world narrowed to the space between them in the garage, the single bare bulb overhead casting long shadows. "Some things," he said, his own voice rough with an emotion he'd long suppressed, "are worth losing a little control over." The moment was shattered by the frantic, static-laced crackle of the CB radio on the workbench. "They're at the water tower. I repeat, they're at the water tower. They've got tools and canisters. I think they're going to poison the water." The final battle for Sierra Springs was triggered by the most essential, life-giving resource in the desert: water. David, in his ultimate act of scorched earth vengeance, had Jaw and his crew attempt to breach the town's water tower, to poison the reservoir and render the town uninhabitable. Under a moonless, pitiless sky, Arthur, Elena, Leo, and 24 determined, grim-faced townsfolk met them there. They formed a silent, unyielding line in the darkness, their figures illuminated by the headlights of a few pickup trucks, a thin blue line against the coming darkness. "It's over, Thorne," Arthur's voice cut through the night, calm and absolute. "The state police have your entire operation documented. They're on their way. Your father's ghost won't be appeased by this." "Nothing will be." "Screw my father's ghost," David screamed, emerging from the shadows, his face contorted into a mask of pure, raving insanity. "Screw all of you. Get them. Burn it all." Jaw and his men charged, a wave of focused violence. But this time, the townsfolk didn't flinch. They stood their ground, and as the first enforcer reached them, a deafening, unified roar filled the air, a sound that was both terrifying and glorious. From every direction, from behind rocks and out of arroyos, the sons of wrath emerged. But they weren't there for David. They were there for the town. Marcus led the charge, his face a grim testament to his reclaimed honor, his club following him into a battle that would cost them everything, because it was the right thing to do. "This ends now," Marcus bellowed, his voice a clarion call as he tackled the massive Jaw to the ground, the two men becoming a whirlwind of fists and fury. A massive, chaotic, desperate brawl erupted at the base of the water tower. It was brutal and unforgiving. The townsfolk, fueled by a righteous fury, fought with a courage they never knew they possessed, using wrenches, tire irons, and sheer numbers to overwhelm Jaw's professionals. Arthur moved through the fray like a force of nature, a whirlwind of controlled, precise violence. He didn't kill, he disabled. A dislocated shoulder here, a shattered kneecap there, a precise nerve strike that dropped a man like a sack of potatoes. He was a surgeon on a battlefield of butchers, neutralizing threats with a terrifying, efficient grace. David, watching his world, his revenge, his very reason for being, collapse into utter chaos, finally snapped completely. He pulled a 9mm handgun from his waistband, his hands shaking, and aimed it at Arthur's back, who was effortlessly disarming two of Jaw's men. "This is for my father," he shrieked, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Leo, his eyes constantly scanning, seeing the threat, didn't hesitate. He launched himself across the intervening space, tackling David from the side with a desperate cry. The gun went off, the shot whining harmlessly into the night sky. Marcus was on them in an instant, a avenging angel in leather, wrenching the weapon from David's grasp and pinning him to the dirt, with a knee pressed hard into his back, the fight gone out of him, replaced by broken, defeated sobs. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly, gloriously closer. The state police, armed with the town's extensive, meticulously gathered evidence, swarmed the area, their floodlights cutting through the darkness, arresting David and his entire crew on a litany of charges that would ensure they never saw the outside of a prison again. In the aftermath, as the sun began to rise over a battered, bruised but unbroken Sierra Springs, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, Marcus approached Arthur. Both men were streaked with dirt and sweat, their clothes torn, but they stood tall. "We're riding out," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "We've got a lot to make up for, a reputation to rebuild. The right way." He extended a hand, a gesture of respect between warriors. "The Sons of Wrath owe you a debt we can never repay. This town," he looked around at the waking community, "is under our protection. From now on. Always. You need us. You call. We'll come." Arthur shook his hand, a firm, solid grip. A bond, forged in the crucible of conflict and redeemed honor, was sealed. They were from different worlds, but they understood the same code. Weeks later, life began to heal, slowly like a desert flower after a rare rain. The town rebuilt, stronger and more united than ever before. Leo became a full-patch member of the Sons of Wrath, his loyalty and courage having earned him the respect of the entire club. A living bridge between two worlds. And Arthur, for the first time, didn't watch from the ridge. He was in the town, his sleeves rolled up, helping to raise a new barn for the Hendersons, his quiet strength a part of the community's foundation. One evening he stood with Elena on the porch of his cabin, watching the lights twinkle on in the valley below. A constellation of hope and resilience. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. "You know," she said softly, her voice a gentle murmur in the twilight, "Old Man Jenkins is finally selling his spread. It connects to your land. Lots of room. Room for a proper workshop. Maybe even a bigger house." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a hope so bright it eclipsed the memory of all the recent darkness. Arthur looked down at her, at the beautiful, strong, resilient woman who had stormed the fortress of his solitary heart, and he felt the last of his ghosts finally quiet, their whispers fading into the peaceful desert night. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, solid and sure, and finally completely home. "A bigger house sounds good," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer feared, an emotion that felt like a new beginning. "As long as you're in it." He was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a guardian. He was a man who had finally found something, someone, to fight for and to live for. The war was over. Arthur Pendleton was finally, truly home. Thank you for watching. What would you do if your quiet town was threatened by a powerful outsider? Subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from, and who would you want in your corner in a fight?